Well, hi everyone. Today we're going to go over a little case study that I did with some colleagues. It was a fun little case study that I did with Blair Botsford from Denton's, Tony Salgado from AMS Wealth, and Ron Stalker, who is a fractional COO and board member of various different companies. He runs his own consulting firm. And we worked through little case study that was centered around exit planning. And we focused in on four different things: some of the valuation concerns, value acceleration, some of the tax and insurance planning, and last but not least, some legal and estate planning matters. So this runs about a little over an hour, but I think it's full of some great points. So if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Just a couple quick notes before we start. If you're interested in this type of content, please subscribe to my channel. And second of all, if you're interested in my newsletter, the details are in the subscription. Would be happy to send you out my newsletter, which is coming out in the month of May. So without further ado, let's get into DunderMifflin Incorporated and exit planning dilemma. Okay, thanks everyone for joining us today. We're going to talk about a case study called DunderMifflin Incorporated, and it's an exit planning dilemma. And it's a case study that holistically explores valuation, operational, financial, and legal concerns with a business transition. And before I begin, let's do some quick introductions. I'm David Prouse from Valuation Business Advisory. Online as well is Blair Botsford from Denton's. We got Tony Salgado from AMS Wealth, and Ron Stalker, who is a fractional COO and on various different boards. And he runs his own independent consulting group. So the learning objectives today are threefold. What are some of the key valuation, operational, financial, and legal considerations for a business owner wishing to transition? Why is it important for exit planning to be done collaboratively? And third, who are the key advisors to the owner in an exit plan? So let's go over the case facts. So Michael Scott is a second generation entrepreneur. He's about 55 and he's looking to retire in the next 5 to 10 years. Runs a manufacturing facility called DunderMifflin Incorporated that manufactures widgets in the fictional town of Scranton, Ontario, and has a long history because his dad started the company. As a business partner, Jim Halpert, who was brought on board before Michael took over the business, he was a friend of the dad. They never used a shareholder agreement since his dad believed in handshake agreements. An alternative fact pattern could be a shareholder agreement does exist, but it's incredibly out of date. Jim has been largely inactive in the business for the past 5 years. Now, DunderMifflin has an operations manager named Susan, who's been in place and working for the company for over 10 years. And Michael has increasingly relied on Susan to handle the operations end of things, while Michael has been focusing more on business development. Susan has some aspirations to get more involved with the business, but is unsure if she'll ever get a chance and has started thinking about looking elsewhere. Now, Michael has 2 children, Angela and Kevin, both of whom are now in their 20s. Both have worked in the business on the administration side. Now, Angela has taken a keen interest in the operations and supply chain. Kevin works for the company too, but has been known to show up late and keeps talking about his interest in becoming a full-time TikTok influencer. Approximately 80% of the Scott's family wealth is tied up in the business. They also own a principal residence, a cottage in Muskoka, and some investments within both registered and non-registered accounts. Michael's wife, Holly, owns 20% of the common shares of DunderMifflin. Jim owns 20%, and Michael owns the remaining 60%. In general, DunderMifflin has been making money because Michael and Holly have been taking generous dividends each year with a salary and occasional bonus. Michael only looks at his financials once a year when his corporate tax return is prepared and filed. Now, Michael admits he does not know how he's performing against his peers in industry and always been satisfied with his lifestyle to this point. He also admits that sometimes he runs personal expenses to the company, but notes that the CRA has never audited him. He is sometimes curious about what his business would fetch in the market. On the other hand, perhaps transitioning the business to his children in the next 5 years would be a better option. Operationally, DunderMifflin's equipment is old compared to the industry, but to save money, Michael has resisted new equipment, and Michael believes that if he sells a company, it will become someone else's problem. Michael has always used an old school approach to sales by relying on handshakes and good charm. He does not believe that contracts are necessary if you trust people. 1/3 of DunderMifflin sales in 2020 came from one customer, 50% came from 3 customers. The land and building owned by DunderMifflin is held inside the operating company, and the company does not finance its operations through any debt. And the last point, the industry in which DunderMifflin competes has been consolidating over the past 3 years, including a few non-North American companies entering the scene. And this is just a quick overview of the distribution of shareholdings. As we mentioned, Michael has 60%, Jim has 20%, Holly has 20%, and we're going to run in the assumption that the fair market value of DunderMifflin Incorporated is $8 million. So before we get started, let's talk about some sobering facts. So this information is all coming from the Exit Planning Institute and PNC Wealth Management in the US and the 2016 State of Owner Readiness Report. So 12 months after selling, 3 out of 4 business owners surveyed profoundly regretted the decision. 70 to 80% of private businesses put on the market don't sell. Only 30% of all family-owned businesses survive into the 2nd generation, 12% survive in the 3rd generation, and only 3% operate at the 4th generation and beyond. So those are pretty sobering statistics. So that explains why exit planning is important. And taking a holistic approach consists of assessing 3 key things. Financial readiness, in other words, what is needed to retire? Business readiness, is the business ready to transfer? And personal readiness, is the owner mentally ready to exit and move on to a post-exit life? So I'm going to start off talking about some valuation and exit planning considerations. Now, if we were to simplify valuation and bring it, the valuation of a business and bring it down to a simple expression, it would be the benefit stream times a multiple. And the benefit stream most commonly seen by people would be earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, or EBITDA. Sometimes smaller businesses would use something called seller discretionary earnings, which is the earnings before the owner pays themselves. And if you've ever seen a formal valuation report, a lot of times we use something called free cash flow or net discretionary earnings, which is something that takes into account both working capital changes, changes in capital CapEx, and as well as an after-tax benefit stream. Now, the multiple has 2 major components. It's the risk of receiving those cash flows and the long-term sustainable growth rate of those cash flows. So if we're going to engage in a value creation program, what we're really talking about is creating long-term sustainable growth for the business and de-risking that business. Now, one of the problems is that somebody gets their business valued. A lot of times they overestimate what their business is worth. So someone might come into Tony and Tony might say, well, you need $5 million, retirement pool to retire comfortably and live the lifestyle that you're used to. And that may require that the business has to be $7 million because they're going to pay some taxes and there's going to be some transaction fees. So the problem is that just because somebody needs $7 million doesn't mean that the business can sell for $7 million or that the business can sell at all. So that's why evaluation is important, because exit planning is it's like going on a journey. You need to know your starting point and you need to know your end point. So the valuation is the starting point, and when you work with your financial advisor, that's the end point. What's also important is value creation takes time. Now, I would say as a bare minimum, you need at least 2 years, because there's usually some tax planning that needs to be done, and some of that needs some time to crystallize. But I think realistically, you probably should give yourself a runway of 3+ years in order to give yourself some time to undertake some of the value creation strategies. And also, some of these things are more persuasive when you're selling to a buyer. When you have the more years of success that you can show, the more persuasive your evidence that some of the value creation strategies that you undertook and some of the changes you made actually paid off. And there really is no too early time. So even if you're like 10+ years away, there's never too early to start getting into a value creation strategy mode. So in this particular case, what are some of the valuation considerations we would make? Well, we take a good hard look at the cash flows. We look at multiple years, but we have to go through something called the normalization of income. So when we're trying to figure out the benefit stream, we'll take a look at, we know, for example, Michael ran through personal expenses to the business. So we're going to have to adjust for that. Real estate, the building and the land are included in the operating company. That is, real estate is generally considered a non-operating asset because the risk of owning real estate is different from the risk of running a business. So we tend to adjust that out. We also do other normalization adjustments, like for example, on the salary side, Michael and Holly probably pay themselves, but the question is, do they pay themselves the same as if they were, commensurate with whatever the roles are in the company? So Michael's a general manager. Does he get paid the same, or does he pay himself much more generously? If Holly's doing some, administrative work in the company, but does she still get paid like a large salary that's not really commensurate with what her role is? We don't know, but that was something we would have to take a look at and normalize. We also know Michael has been slow at kind of deferring his capital expenditures, so we would have to factor in some adjustments for CapEx, because the prospective purchaser is going to take a look at that and they realize they're going to have to make some investments in newer equipment. And last but not least, we know Michael hasn't really been keeping up with what his peers are doing, so we would have to take a look at financial ratios. We take a look at benchmarking, because what we really want to know is DunderMifflin like an average company? Is it above average, or is it below average? Because that's going to impact the valuation. So what are some of the exit options for Michael and Holly, and what are some of the pros and cons? So we can divide the options into external and internal. So the external options are, the most likely one would be a sale to a third party. And when we do sales to third parties, there's two different types of buyers. There's the financial buyer and a strategic or synergistic buyer. The financial buyer is basically the equivalent of somebody just like Michael comes along, maybe, he has his family, maybe somebody had sold an earlier business and wants to get into another business. So they would buy that business solely based on the cash flows of DunderMifflin, basically buying it at its intrinsic value. But we do know, for example, that there's other companies entering into the industry who are looking to consolidate. Now, if they don't have a foothold in North America yet, they may be in a situation where it may be strategically advantageous to buy out DunderMifflin. And in that case, they may be willing to actually pay a premium on top of just the cash flows. So that's the ideal. If you want to max out your proceeds, you would like to sell to a strategic or synergistic buyer. Some of the other options could include a sale to private equity, and with a enterprise value of around $8 million. It's, if it's making a lot of money, DunderMifflin there could be an outside chance that there could be some smaller private equity firms that could be potentially interested. There's a small chance of a recapitalization, and a recapitalization would be a situation where usually private equity is coming along. They're not necessarily buying 100% of the company out. So what would likely happen is maybe they might buy anywhere between 51 to 80% and leave 20% rollover equity for Michael. So maybe Michael, in that case, he wants to continue on, but he wants to also grow with the company and work with the private equity firm. That's a possibility as well. The worst option is going to be liquidating the company, because that's going to result in the least amount of net funds at the end of the day, because the business is, you're going to close the business, you're going to lay everybody off, and you're going to sell your equipment. And if it's manufacturing equipment that's very specialized, you might just get scrap value or 10 cents on the dollar. So you're not going to get a lot of money going through the liquidation. But unfortunately, a lot of businesses end up going through that option, not by choice, but simply because they have no other option. I list IPO there. That is in general an external option, but it's certainly not going to be an option, a realistic option in this particular case. Some of the internal options: transfer to family. So we do know Angela and Kevin are involved in the business to a degree. The question with family is always going to be, do they have the competence to run the business? Do they have an interest in running the business? So we know Angela certainly has some interest in running the business. Maybe she's an option in the future to transition the business. But the question is, how long would that take to do that, to get her up to the proper level of competence? We know that Kevin is involved in the business, but not very interested. So, is he really a good option? Probably not. But those are things that we'd have to kind of work through. Other options include a transfers to management. So we know, for example, Susan has been increasingly involved with the business. She certainly has an interest in it. So is she somebody that can be mentored over the next 5 to 10 years to take over the business, groomed for that position? Or maybe we can bring in someone from the outside to be, the president of the company. These are some of the options that are available. I've crossed out employee stock option plans. That's a potential internal option, but again, not a realistic one in this particular case. So what are the key value drivers in this case? And this is where we start talking about business readiness. And I tend to think of value drivers kind of in two different categories. There's growth and there's de-risking. And a value driver can, generally could accomplish both things, but they tend to fall on one side of the aisle or the other. So based on the facts in this case, we sort of have 4 main kind of drivers that we would take a look at. So number one, to what degree is there management team separation between Michael and the management team? So right now we know it just seems to be Susan. We don't know the strength of her team, but this is something that we would have to take a deeper look at to see to what degree can Michael step away from the business. Right now, does he have the ability to go on vacation for a couple of weeks and not have to worry about it? Or is he, is he still involved with the business on a day-to-day basis? Or, can he get to a point where he's almost taking kind of like a board of director role, and he's kind of fully removed from the business? That would be the ideal case. So I don't think he's there yet, but that's something we would have to take a look at. We know there's a customer concentration issue. So we know, for example, there's 3 customers represent 50% of the revenues of the business. That's a huge amount of concentration. If one of those businesses decides they're not going to work with Mifflin anymore, or if one of those businesses is in a situation where, let's say, because of COVID, they go under, that could be a very large hit to Mifflin's revenue stream. And with such a big concentration, the business can go from very profitable to either break even or losing money very quickly. So that's a huge amount of risk that a potential buyer is going to look at. So that's something that, before we go through the transition, we need to start fixing up. We know Michael does not take a look at his financials. So, we know how important cash flow is to the valuation of a business. So if you don't have any insight into what's going on, you can't budget, you can't forecast your business. That's a situation that's not really ideal. So Michael needs to start taking a look at how his business is doing, how it's doing relative to peers. What are some of his key performance indicators? He needs to have the ability to take a look into the future and gain some insight. And it's kind of like driving a car. Again, you want to have some idea of kind of where you're going, how fast you're going, where you are along the path. And the financials is just one particular aspect of it. The fact that he doesn't take a look at his financials, I wouldn't be surprised if there's other aspects of the business they'd also sitting up his head maybe, but like operations or sales and marketing, where he doesn't really track any sort of key metrics. So on the operations side, maybe a lot of it's sitting up in his head. So he needs to have some documentation of his systems and processes, and it needs to be in a situation where somebody can come and buy his business and understand how his business runs, because if it's all sitting up in his head, there's a large transferability issue. So on the personal readiness side, what are some of the things we need to consider? So there's really 2 different things that really can happen on the personal readiness side. The first scenario could be the exit goes through, but there's a huge amount of regret because the owner hasn't really thought about what their post-exit world looks like. They're very much tied to their business. They've been working 60 hours a week in it, and it's part of their identity. And all of a sudden that's gone now. And they never thought about, well, what does life look like, after this point in time? So that can be a very scary situation. What can also happen is on the pre-exit side is that the owner is so scared of that situation because they don't know what's going to happen. They actually kind of sabotage the deal and end up either, the deal doesn't go through, or they don't necessarily get a great price because they're kind of sabotaging it. So what are some of the options for Michael? We would have to, sit down and talk with him, but he maybe just wants to retire. He's tired. He wants to go enjoy the good life. Maybe he wants to do some consulting. Maybe he wants to start a new business. Philanthropy could be something he's been thinking about for a while. If Scranton, Ontario is a small town, maybe he's a bigwig in town because his family's been around there for a while and he wants to take on some, board roles or be a mentor. So these are all things that we would have to kind of talk to Michael about, but we should deal with them before the exit, not afterward. And the last point I'm going to make is there is a minority interest problem here. And it's because there's either no shareholders agreement or probably a very poorly worded one. And one of the problems is that Jim owns 20% of the company, but I'm going to make an assumption here that the shareholder agreement, certainly if one doesn't exist, but even in a poorly worded one, probably doesn't get into how are they going to value Jim's shares. And you might think, well, if he owns 20% and the business is worth, $8 million, wouldn't it be worth $1.6 million? Well, no, that's not necessarily the way it works. If we have minority interest and we're valuing it on a standalone basis, we're in a situation where that minority interest, because a lot of times in minority interest, there's a minority interest discount that's applied to it because such a type of share is not necessarily as attractive as buying a whole company. So there's discounts for basically lack of control. There's things, you only have 20%, so you don't control the company. And there's also a discount because there's just a lack of marketability because there's less buyers who'd be interested in buying that 20% portion than buying the whole company. So we don't know based on the facts how much that discount would be. But the problem is that Jim's probably thinking to himself, well, my shares are going to be worth 1.6 million. The problem is it probably isn't. So when it comes time to, sell the company, maybe at the 11th hour, there's a big dispute over money. Okay, so that's something that needs to be worked out in a shareholders agreement. The shareholders agreement should talk about whether there's a discount to be applied. Could sometimes, I've seen some shareholders agreements that are based on formulas, but again, you need to spell out how that's going to work. The other thing a shareholders agreement is important is that it's going to cover off the 5 Ds. So death, disagreement, disability, divorce, and disaster. If something like, Jim dies or he becomes disabled or he divorces, these are things that impact DunderMifflin, and Michael may not like it. So if you don't have a good shareholders agreement or you don't have one at all, you may be in a situation where you have a big payout to Jim or Jim's estate and you can't afford it. And that's going to be extremely problematic. So anyways, we've covered off some valuation and exit planning considerations. Now I'm going to hand the ball off to Ron, and he's going to talk about how types of things that we can do to create value and improve the business.
Thanks, Dave. So the good news here is that we have a prospective 5 to 10 year timeline. And there are things that we'll want to do here that are impactful in both the short term and the long term, and whether the company is going to be sold or whether it's going to be a transition to the children. So we do have a fair market value of $8 million. There will be no doubt an optimal value based on fixing some of the discounted items that have been identified in the business valuation report. And then finally, as Dave mentioned, what is the goal here based on the financial planning? So we've got 5 to 10 years to work on this. What's very typical, and certainly apparent in this case, there is no real business planning, no real budgeting. So that's the first thing that the company has to start with. And within that plan, there have to be items from the business valuation report, also key priorities. And I highlight the word executable. A lot of business plans tend to be more dreams. They'll have a plan. They want to grow by 10%, but really no detail on how to get there. The other big one is transitioning Michael to arm's length. Very typically, everything is tied up with the owner, and this hinders. I mean, this is what drove them and made them successful in the first place, but now it limits the company going forward. three key areas that I like to look at are building the team, certainly implementing growth plans, and then working on optimizing the processes in the business. From an immediate standpoint, for Michael, he should start to see more personal time. As the company starts to perform better, his income will go up. And with all of those in place and him at arm's length, the value of the company is going up. So it's a win-win all around. Next slide. Really important area to look at first is building the team. And the first thing that has to be considered is the management team. Michael needs, and all owners need to be able to delegate. This is not only for the long term, but also in the immediate. You know, we talk about somebody getting beer trucked or run over by the bus. How do you ensure continuity with the business? There's a great article written by Mark Wardell that talks about how you could double the value of a business. And here you have a business, in this case, that is primarily owner-driven, a little bit of people-driven. That would be some of the business knowledge resides with Susan, but that's about it. There is no evidence of really clearly documented standard operating procedures. So as you move and start transitioning this knowledge to documented procedures, you can start to work on the business. The highest level you get to is when you get a culture-driven business. And this is where the people now, not only management, but all the employees of the business know what is expected, the procedures to follow, and they will also start to drive improvements as opposed to everything being done by the owner. When we get to people, there's really a lot of HR issues on one side. These things can consume a huge amount of management's time, which will then distract them from the day-to-day running of the business, and also any time to work on planning and key priorities. Hiring, terminations can take up a lot of time. And in fact, that can be an issue with a lot of companies where there's just a reluctance to terminate non-performing employees. And that just creates, you know, the old one, rotten apple spoils the whole basket. Turnover can be a problem. And again, now you've got people with minimal experience, and so they're not productive to for a number of months or even a year or so. So you've got that expense with no productivity. So once these things are taken care of with clearly defined policies and procedures, and you know, to make sure that the company is in compliance with Ministry of Labor and Employment Standards Act requirements, that's going to help a lot. On an individual level, when employees have clear role descriptions and duties checklists, which in fact really look like standard operating procedures for the role, you can now make sure that there's no gaps in the work being done. There's backup. There's transition when new employees come in. And with that, you can now make sure that there's proper training, that the employees have got the proper tools and resources to do the work that they're responsible for. A big one in any business, and research has shown that health and safety can have a dramatic impact on employee culture. I've seen that in a number of companies, and a great example was Alcoa, where an incoming CEO focused globally on health and safety, and it transformed the company and its profitability. It's also a great way to engage with employees because it's a point of commonality. Everybody agrees that no one wants to get hurt, die prematurely, and they all want to be able to provide for their families. So once management works with the employees on things that they share in common, you start to establish relationships and communication. The company can then move on to other productivity improvement initiatives. And finally, and this is a big part of the culture piece, but the focus on continuous improvement. And when that becomes a mindset within the organization, it starts to drive itself forward of its own accord. So then we get to the growth piece. And as David mentioned, the real focus on EBITDA. So there's certainly an immediate short-term focus on that, but then also, what is that going to look like in the future? And are the earnings, the sales, is that all sustainable over a 5 to 10 year period? Will the business in fact be relevant or competitive in 5 to 10 years? So now when we get to the sales side, and again, so many companies don't have an executable sales plan, don't have a proper budget. Once you start building in target numbers, accountabilities, activities, timelines, milestones, the company can actually start to move the ball down the field. And I'll share just a couple thoughts on the considerations that David had mentioned previously. But if you are looking to grow, you really have to assess the market and see if there is potential, in fact, to gain share. We don't know what the share of DunderMifflin is, but if you're going to grow, you're obviously going to have to take share, or just take or maintain a share of a growing pie. We don't know what the competition is doing. We don't know. And again, there are some businesses that are in decline, some are in growth mode. We don't know what the case is here. We talked about the product and product differentiation. If everybody's selling the same thing, then everything becomes price driven, and then no one makes much money. What is the life cycle? Where's the product in its life cycle stage? We know that the widgets that they're selling have been now around for at least 25 years. A lot of products have a natural life cycle. Also, we don't get a sense here that there is continuous improvement and refinement of the products. And I've seen a number of cases where products were being surpassed by newer innovations from other competitors, and we talked about some offshore competition moving in. So it could be that the current products are not going to be relevant in 5 or 10 years, notwithstanding any kind of sales plans. There are cases, well, these widgets, they're being supplied to a couple of key customers, perhaps they're hard spec'd in. What happens when management changes? What happens when the engineering department changes? What happens when a buyer changes? All of a sudden, these widgets might now be put back on the market and into competition. Is DunderMifflin going to be competitive? Another common issue, especially with long-term relationships between sellers and buyers, is that pricing might be lower than it could be. It's been well studied, and often the perceived pricing in the market is about 10% lower than what it actually is. So there may be opportunities simply for price increases. That can only be sustained if the value proposition is aligned with the needs of the customers, and it's being supported with good order fulfillment that the company is easy to do with. There may be opportunities here for the introduction of e-commerce. Don't know the nature of the business, but certainly this is a trend everywhere and things that DunderMifflin have to consider. And when it comes to the customers now, we've got relationships, and we mentioned that Michael likes to do the business development. Oftentimes, these B2B relationships are owner to owner. These things do have a life cycle. Owners retire, owners pass away, they retire, and then the relationship, the buy-sell relationship, opens up to the market. So this could be at risk, and certainly if these relationships are 25, 30 years old, there is a risk there. So you want to transfer that relationship and make it company to company as opposed to owner to owner. And the final point that David mentioned, and it's a real serious one, not only for the current state of the business, but with 3 companies contributing 50% of the revenue, a really highly risky situation, and does have to be dealt with. Next slide. And so we any business, and this is so common with owner-operated businesses, that they just don't have standard operating procedures for their core processes. When you start documenting these, you now have opportunities to streamline and optimize. And it's not a one-shot process, but something that is ongoing. When you get this culture based on continuous improvement, you're continuing to work and improve these processes. When they're looking at various expenses within the business, however, without good financial reporting, there's no way to work on improving the operating expenses of the company. This may be a case where it would be beneficial to bring in a fractional CFO. It can review all the finance and administration processes and the reporting, make sure that they're useful and that they in fact are used in operating the business. When we get to productivity improvement opportunities, they mentioned about old equipment. This is going to be an issue, whether it's a succession play or it's a sale of the business. It could be also a limitation if the company is planning to grow and they just don't have the capability to scale. As David mentioned, there's no flexibility. If they lose a major customer, you've got a huge fixed cost base and it's going to put them in serious shape. So a lot of work to be done here. There may be opportunities, certainly in the manufacturing operation, to introduce some digital technology, whether it's scanning, touch screens, anything like that that can just improve both the efficiency and the productivity of the workforce. Finally, any kind of continuous improvement methodologies like 5S or Lean, really brilliant stuff done by the Japanese, very easily understood by employees in any place that I've introduced these. Absolutely no problem, easy to understand, easy to implement by the workforce, but have a dramatic effect on the operation of the business, and surprisingly also on the culture of the company. A big one here is certainly the IT platform with hacking and ransomware. Big issue, especially in the smaller companies, and it could put the company at serious risk, particularly so since we don't have good evidence of documentation. If they get hacked, they could be in serious trouble. And finally, it's a truism out there, but productivity trumps cost. There is a propensity among business owners to really focus on the day-to-day and the little things and not the priorities. And we like to say that they should avoid standing on the dollars to pick up pennies. Two other thoughts, and I hadn't put it in my earlier notes. This is a manufacturing business. If they have machining centers and they're producing metal scrap and it goes into bins that are stored outside, you can have a real problem potentially with cutting fluids, etc., leaking from the bins and getting into the ground. This is another reason why you really want to separate the business from the building and the land. But it is going to be something that is going to look at by any potential buyer. And finally, there are a lot of things that can be done. An owner is well advised to get help. They shouldn't hesitate to reach out for expert advice and assistance. Tony.
Thanks, Ron, and thanks, Dave. I think that when we first came together collectively, we said we all work in the space of business transition and business succession planning. And we all realize on this call that we all bring a unique skill set to help the business owner through this. So why not show the consumer and show you, the viewer and the listener, how we do this? And so far we've covered valuation techniques and strategies. We've covered operational issues and opportunities. And now we're going to look at some financial consequences and estate planning with Blair when we get to wills and what do we need to know about when we do that. And the whole concept and our goal and our main objective is to make you understand that so many people have a part to play. And there's so many different consequences and considerations when you think about what are you going to do with your most valuable asset? How are you going to be removing yourself? And because ultimately, I always use this as a saying where people die, but corporations don't. People will pass away, people will become disabled, but a corporation, you actually need to do something with those shares. You actually either need to buy them out, wind them up, redeem them. These are all things that actually need to happen because they won't happen automatically. Automatically, we may have some tax and estate liquidity issues. So how do we address those issues? This family scenario is not too different from what we all deal with every single day. Every single day we're talking to family businesses, and maybe the names are going to change. Maybe it's going to be 3 kids instead of 2 kids. But really fundamentally, we're looking at these valuation, operational, tax, and estate issues that are very present in an everyday family business we speak to. And I have to mention that I did love that quote that Ron had on one of his slides, where culture eats strategy for breakfast. I absolutely love that, where it's so real. Strategy can change day to day, but culture is very, very hard to change. And it takes a very long time to change. And so when you have a good culture, it's going to beget good things and good results. When it comes to tax and liquidity issues, this case is a prime example of really 2 things. And on this slide, you'll see this fair versus equal and where's the cash. So I'm going to focus on this fundamental concept of what happens if the family-owned business does transfer to Angela and not necessarily Kevin. So we were told early on in the case facts that Kevin is an avid TikTok user, not really interested in assuming ownership and control of the family business. So what happens if the natural succession is in fact for Angela to take over the business? And so if the dad, Michael, were to bequest the share ownership to Angela, what do we leave for Kevin? In most family-owned businesses, if it's not 80%, 70%, or 90%, it's a significant percentage of the value of the family wealth will be tied up into the family business. So ultimately, do we want Kevin to continue to participate in the work that Angela may one day provide? And so this is something that we kind of look at to say, can we use corporate-owned insurance? And in this context, we're talking about corporate-owned life insurance to provide a liquidity buyout event for Kevin. Because if we're going to have a capital asset, such as the family business for Angela, what kind of capital assets are we going to leave for Kevin? In this case, we have about 20% of the family wealth outside of the family business. But now that 20% of the family wealth is also subject to tax. So, and these are all gross numbers. We need to really dig into, and this is a whole session on its own. This is like a 2-hour session just on what is the after-tax result of all of this planning. But just keeping it very, very simple. If we have 8 million in a family business, 2 million outside, we have some significant tax consequences that we need to deal with. And we look at tax consequences of private company shares. We have multiple layers of tax upon death, potentially. You know, it is true when they say that when you die, it is probably the biggest tax bill you're going to pay. So in the province of Ontario, the highest marginal tax rate is 53.5%. That's correct, over 50%. And when you pass away owning private company shares, there are 3 layers of tax that you will be exposed to. Now, whether or not you have the proper advice and the proper planning in place to address these 3 layers of tax is another cool question, right? So in this case, we saw that there's no family trust, there's no holding company, there's no separate corporation for real estate. Not a lot of the tax planning has been done. And so we have a valuable asset that continues to be exposed to bad tax things. Now, one of the best ways to address a lot of this bad tax things, particularly upon death, would be to use corporate-owned insurance. Why is that the case? Corporate-owned insurance is received by the corporation tax-free. It provides you a liquidity event. The liquidity can be used to either buy out a shareholder, in this case, maybe it's going to be appropriate for Kevin, or to pay for the death tax resulting from the passing away of Michael. So if Michael passes away and the shares are left to the kids, let's assume they're not left to a spouse. What is the tax bill coming out of an $8 million share? Is it 2 million? Is it 4 million? Is it higher? Well, it's going to depend. It's going to depend on what the post-mortem planning is going to be. But I can tell you it's going to be probably at least 2 million. And where is the cash coming from to fund the 2 million? Is it going to come from a cottage that needs to be disposed of at a taxable event? Is it going to come from non-registered investments? So there is not enough liquidity. And so if there's not enough liquidity, how do you create liquidity? And this is kind of part of the conversation of how you help a family business transition from one generation to the next. Do we have the proper corporate structure in place, which in this case, you can clearly see we don't. And secondly, do we have the right corporate insurance strategy to allow for a tax-efficient wealth transition? Dave, let's see the next slide. So what are some other facts or things that we need to think about? We need to think about shareholder buyouts. So we know that we still have, in this case, a small minority interest. And that small minority interest can prove to be a big problem. So what happens for buyouts? Are there appropriate provisions in the shareholders agreement, super important to have one properly drafted, that provide us with a description and a detailed roadmap as to what to do if Jim were to pass away? Does Jim's spouse want to be in business with this family? Does this family want to be in business with Jim's spouse? Probably not. And so if we assume that Jim's shares are worth 1.6 million, we're not taking into account a minority discount, does the corporation have $1.6 million of cash to buy out Jim's spouse? These are all significant events that could dramatically impact this family business. And if you get in front of it and if you plan for it, these events will happen, but we'll be properly prepared. Let's look at the other assets the family has. Cottages. So is the cottage going to be taxable upon death? Probably, because if we're going to be using the principal residence exemption on the city home, the cottage is probably going to be taxable. My favorite or my worst favorite, registered plans. RRSPs in particular, RIFs. In Ontario, highest marginal rate is 53.5%. If you leave $1 million inside your RIF or your RRSP, how much do you think your beneficiaries are going to get? Less than 50%. They're going to get 47 points on the dollar. Not a best tax efficient strategy. And lastly, I'm going to conclude with Susan. Don't forget about your key employees. Your key employees are value creators and value drivers. So what type of financial planning are you considering for Susan? And don't automatically assume that you have to give her shares. There are other financial planning techniques and strategies you can implement to make sure that Susan wants to stick around. Thank you. Off to you, Blair.
Thank you. Thanks, gentlemen. Now it's time for the lawyer, the thorn amongst the roses. So getting into the dry, dusty legal side of things, or so sometimes people think. I mean, where we start is with know your client, and not in the sense of the banking sense when you go to open an account, the core know your client things. This is a much deeper dive into getting to know your client, because it's going to set the foundation for the whole discussion that's going to take place. And it's not one conversation, it's not a quick phone call, it's not a 1 hour meeting. It's going to take a little while to get down into the weeds and collect core information. And right out of the gate, the thing that lawyers keep in mind is the potential for conflicts of interest. You've got Mike and Holly, they own different proportions of the company. We're not sure yet about title or ownership of other assets. So there's, on the face of it, a potential power imbalance. They might have different goals and objectives. And if the firm or my colleagues, say, was doing some of the corporate work, we wouldn't necessarily want to get conflicted out down the road if, heaven forbid, the relationship breaks down with Mike and Holly. So you want to figure out who's the client, never mind knowing more details about the client. And if there's going to be a shareholders agreement made or one updated, if we're representing Mike and the company, we're not also going to represent Jim on that. He's going to have to get some independent legal advice. So we're looking for basic core level things, conflicts of interest. So because we have a duty of absolute loyalty to our clients. Looking at the joint retainer situation, if we do represent Mike and Holly, making sure they understand no secrets between them, that one can't call me later and say, psst, about the child from another relationship, that nobody knows anything about this. I have never had that call, by the way, but anecdotally it's out there in the profession. So if we do act for joint parties on a file, I can't have one or the other calling me up and saying, don't tell my spouse about that, and I'm going to kind of deal with this side issue over here. And it sort of undermines that holistic approach to planning if all of a sudden you're keeping secrets from one party or the other. And then we know we need to confirm things like citizenship. Don't want to accidentally find out down the road that someone is also like a dual citizen. There's US citizenship there. Want to confirm marital status. I think the facts describe Mike and Holly, husband and wife. People will loosely throw that out there, and you'll find out a month into a file that they're not married spouses, they're common law spouses, and the legal rules about rights and entitlements there are different in Ontario between married and common law. Status of the children, are they children of that relationship, or is one of them a stepchild, because there are different legal parameters there. You want to know about the health status of your clients as well, or others around them, so that if there's disability planning, particular issues are concerned. And that just doesn't necessarily come out right out of the gate. It's a little awkward. You first met a client and into it, do you have health issues? Do you have something that would impair your ability to go through this process? So yeah, we're not always the most popular people in the room, because we ask people some of their very worst questions when we don't necessarily know them very well. Then we need obviously full financial disclosure. What do they own? What it's worth? How is it held? Who's on title? Joint ownership with rights of survivorship, tenancy in common, who are the beneficiary designations. We want to know where things are currently. Back to David's point out of the gate about the trip. Where are you now and where are you trying to get to? Without that background information and knowing that starting point, very easy to make assumptions as you're trying to put together the appropriate structuring of maybe changes to title, changes to designations, what's flowing through the estate and covered by the will, and what's going in a different direction. If I don't know the starting point, likely I'm going to make the wrong suggestion to people. If there are family law agreements, we definitely want to see that. If there is an existing shareholder agreement, see that. Even if, say, Mike and Holly wanted to do I'm going to call a mutual estate plan, because they've decided they are going to give some to the kids up front, and they're going to opt out of other family law or estate rights and entitlements between spouses, there are ways to do what I would call a stripped down family law agreement that ties together this unified plan, so that down the road, one or the other person, the survivor, can't upend that and defeat the interests of the other person when they started that joint planning. Another thing to inquire about is other financial dependents. So there could be, parents, siblings, other people in the mix that, right on the face of it, you wouldn't necessarily know about. Are there regular streams of payments or assistance being provided to other people? Or has there been an expectancy created so that someone's going to come out of the woodwork and challenge the estate? So if we don't investigate those things up front, can have some problems. And state lawyers our duties are not just to our client. We actually have responsibility to a frustrated beneficiary whose interests were defeated because we didn't go through this due diligence process. So yeah, our responsibility extends a little farther than the immediate client sitting in front of us, or right now the other end of a Zoom call. So once, we've collected up and kind of sorted through all the background information and are starting to get a sense of goals and expectations from the client, I mean, going to talk to them about things like the cottage and the home, which one really should be the principal residence. From a tax perspective, I'm not necessarily answering that question, but tax accountant, tax lawyer is going to look at those issues to get the best net result. And people tend not to want to think about this. It's the near term. Who would make decisions on a person's behalf if they have an illness, temporary incapacity, a longer term disability? A lot of estate planning, business succession planning tends to focus on death. Just I'm here or I'm not here, as opposed to the gray zone that exists in between. And that can actually be the more challenging one to navigate. A long-term illness or disability can be quite financially, straining on families and the business, but just that personal decision-making. Who would make healthcare decisions if the person wasn't able to speak for themselves? Who's going to make financial decisions if the person is either on the positive side, they might go on an extended holiday and they're just not around for a while and bills need to get paid, taxes filed, what have you, or there could be a loss of mental capacity and a need for decision making. So that's the personal, the powers of attorney element of things. And for business owners, we talked to them about possibly having a separate POA for property that's limited to the shares in the company, because the person would have the knowledge and skill to vote the shares, which then, appoints the directors, and directors appoint officers, and gets into the operational elements of the company. If you have someone who isn't aligned with what's going on in the business and they're entitled to vote the shares for their benefit and maybe not entirely in line with the bigger picture benefit of the company, you want to think about that that level of decision making. And then tying into what Tony was talking about and everyone else is corporate structuring and dealing with short and long-term illness or disability. I mean, it could be, to Ron's issues, actual operational decision-making components, but there's the funding of what happens. So if there's a short-term disability or illness that turns into a long-term disability, say there's a buyout provision in the shareholder agreement, I see this where, again, it's a focus. Yeah, there'll be there's a mandatory insurance clause in there for the buyout on death. And there are provisions in there about turfing a shareholder on reaching a certain milestone of disability that goes, but there's no insurance provision in there to cover off, say, long-term care, critical illness insurance, what have you. So how do you fund the buyout on disability? So it's great to cover the issue, but you need the money to do it. So yeah, shareholder agreements can be really, really useful tool, especially while people are on friendly terms, to cover off what could be very distressing and difficult to negotiate issues when the money's needed. Business partners are wrangling with each other. Nobody's happy. The business is getting rocky. Employees are fleeing because they get, a sense of things in the wind. Better to do it now. And then as the clients are starting to think about, the longer term, how they want assets distributed down the road, get into, is it all going to the surviving spouse? There are family law, state law rights that spouses have, a little different for married versus common law. But some people that they're doing well, they're comfortable financially, will think about, well, we're going to accelerate a portion of the inheritance to the kids. We'll go, well, maybe it's 70% to spouse and 30% to kids. And as long as they cover that off, other ways to avoid a lawsuit, then, at what age should kids or grandchildren get assets if here with, I think it's Angela and Kevin, if they're reasonably mature, responsible adults, there might not be an issue about having their portion go outright. If there are spendthrift issues, other financial management issues, disability, substance abuse issues, mental health, then we look at trust structuring to protect those people from themselves. And just to help younger generations achieve financial literacy, we really do encourage stage distributions. So maybe some capital at 21, some at 25, balance at age 30 if the grandchildren were to inherit, rather than just a big inheritance landing on people. But every client has a slightly different perspective on this. Some take that I'm not here, so as long as they're at least 18, I'm not going to be around to watch the train wreck, so it doesn't matter. But I'd say the bulk of my clients who've worked hard to achieve things, and it's not that they fundamentally mistrust their family members, but they remember what they were like at a younger age and stage of life. And so typically, it's definitely not all at 21. And then it's tailored to the specific circumstances. And here with private company shares, a basic planning strategy just to avoid the provincial estate administration tax, which is a whopping 1.5% in Ontario. But 15,000 per million, it does start to add up. So we use dual wills, put non-probatable assets like private company shares in the secondary will. The distribution scheme may be identical under primary and secondary. It really is just saving, the provincial tax and making it easier for the company to keep functioning along. Probate can be a bit of a tedious task here. Some of the jurisdictions where we file, the waiting time to get the certificate back is quite long. Dying in Toronto can be a very slow, painful experience in terms of the estate administration. We're telling people about 6 to 9 months to get probate in Toronto. So that's not to encourage people to run out and put everything in joint names, though. Please don't do that. So the flip side of the probate planning is do reasonable, sensible things to avoid it, but don't go the other extreme and expose your assets to creditors of others, family law claims of the other co-owners of property. That's the downside of joint ownership. So I spend a lot of time counseling people about the good, the bad, and the really ugly of joint ownership. Something else that I try and talk to every client about is whether or not they have charitable giving interests, or not-for-profit interests, because a lot of people do tend to have philanthropic interests. And so we build that into the estate planning as well. And then really where we're coming at with this is, what is the legacy the client wants to leave with their family, with their business partners, employees, their community, and of what's that lasting impression? And I say this as the last question. I'd ideally like this to be the first question that I ask my clients. And some people come in armed. They've been through this thinking process, either because it's an update to estate planning as opposed to a start. But sometimes people are not ready to answer that question. They haven't done the full thinking because they haven't had a chance to contemplate that post-exit life and who am I, where am I in the universe. But that's ultimately sort of what we're getting at. And sometimes it takes this, multiple professional interaction and repeated discussions and going deeper into the layer to get to what is it that I'm really trying to do? What am I leaving behind? And how does this relate to me as a person in my family? So that's where we're getting at with clients is legacy planning. And this is what it takes to get there. A little bit of introspection and a whole pile of information and lots of hopefully qualified and talented professionals around our clients. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to drive it home now. So the key takeaways from this afternoon's presentation. First of all, failing to plan is planning to fail. It takes longer than owners think to plan for succession, and the process is an ongoing one of incremental change and adjustment. So like I said, you really need to think in multiple years. This is not something that you want to do over 90 days or 6 months. You really need to set aside multiple years, and it's really never too early to start thinking about it. Succession planning is not a one profession exercise, and is not one profession at a time exercise. It is a collaborative effort. We each come at this from a different perspective, and we could all be helping one particular client together at the same time, but working on different things. So there's a lot of moving pieces. So keep in mind that complexity. Business owners are people with hopes, dreams, identities, and it can be strongly tied to the business, and that can be intertwined in their lives to their family and the community. However, not all family members are necessarily going to share the same interest or passion or business, but at the same point in time, we also have to think about, equity between family members. Starting the succession planning process from a family enterprise perspective can achieve better results than just simply focusing just on the business and the financial value, which can be highly liquid. So, the family aspect is, another dimension that makes the process even further complex. So that's today's presentation. I hope everybody learned a lot and enjoyed it. Please keep in mind, if you do run into any issues, if you're a business owner out there with these type of issues and you're starting to think about it, please feel free to contact us, or if you have a trusted advisor already, please contact them. Start the process now. Don't wait. Anyways, thank you very much. Appreciate it, and hope the rest of your day is great.